Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into one of the absolute most fascinating transformations in all of human history, the scaling up of early Indian society. We're going to trace a very strict chronological chain of cause and effect to see exactly how people went from living in small, nomadic, kin-based groups all the way to organizing themselves into massive, highly structured, continent-spanning empires. It's an incredible story of technology, geography, and human ambition, and our source material lays it out perfectly. We'll uncover the secrets of the Iron Age, dive right into the rise of agriculture, and watch the political map expand in real time. Okay, let's dive into our roadmap for this explainer. We'll start with iron and agriculture, move on to the shift from Jana to Janapada, explore the 16 Mahajanapadas, jump into the age of empires, and finally wrap up with a quick recap. All right, Section 1, Iron and Agriculture. This is where the spark of change really happens. To really wrap our heads around this evolution, we've got to anchor ourselves in time first. Check out this timeline, which covers roughly 3,000 years of history. Timelines like this are crucial because they show us the actual rhythm of how things changed. Notice how incredibly slow that initial growth is, taking a whole 1,000 years just to shift where settlements are located, compared to the explosive, snowballing rise of empires later on. Around 2000 BCE, you've just got simple kin-based groups living up in the Septuaginta region in the northwest. But as we move toward 1000 to 800 BCE, distinct territorial states begin popping up. Fast forward to 300 BCE, and boom, we witness the sudden rise of massive empires in the north, followed centuries later, around 700 CE, by incredibly powerful regional empires in the south. The political organization just grows increasingly complex, and it's all driven by what was happening right on the ground. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly what that ground-level change looked like. This NCERT map shows the first millennium BCE, specifically highlighting early finds of iron implements heavily concentrated right along the Ganga River Valley. This geography, this is the literal starting point for massive societal change. The center of early Vedic culture was actively shifting from the northwest directly into the highly fertile Ganga plains. And finding iron concentrated here tells an amazing story of adaptation. See, iron was a harder, way more durable metal than copper or bronze. Its discovery in these eastern regions meant that, for the very first time, early settlers had the raw materials they needed to truly conquer their environment. So, what was the direct effect of those new iron tools? It was absolutely massive. We're talking a full-blown agricultural revolution. Before iron, clearing the incredibly dense, monsoon-fed forests of the Ganga Plains was a nearly impossible task. But iron axes? They allowed people to finally chop right through that thick timber. And iron plowshares could dig deep into the heavy, clay-rich, fertile soil. The sources tell us this directly led to a wider variety of crops being cultivated. Most importantly, wet paddy, or rice. Now, rice cultivation is incredibly labor-intensive. It requires serious, coordinated community effort just to transplant the seedlings. But man, the payoff was huge. It generated an unprecedented agricultural surplus. Suddenly, you had immense food stability, and that stability meant people no longer had to constantly pack up and move. They became permanently tied to specific, highly productive pieces of land. Moving right along to Section 2, Jana to Janapada, a massive shift in identity. So you might be wondering, what happens when a whole nomadic society suddenly settles down? Well, that simple act of permanently settling completely rewired how these ancient people identified themselves and how they did politics. Before the agricultural boom, people belonged to a Jana, which is basically a community bound primarily by blood, family, and kinship ties. Your identity was tied to your clan, not a physical location on a map. You were loyal to your extended family unit, wherever they happened to roam. But as farming anchored everyone to the specific fields they cleared, the Jana evolved into the Janapada. That word literally translates to where a people first set its feet. Think about what a monumental psychological and political shift that is. Identity was now based on territory and land, rather than just who your ancestors were. Belonging to a Janapada meant you were tied to the soil, which paved the way for the very concept of a defined bordered state. You can actually visualize this as a giant snowball effect. It literally scales civilization up step by step. It starts small with the Kula, the basic family household. Then several families group together to form a Jana, the kin-based clan. As they settle down and claim land, they become a Janapada, a territorial state. Eventually, as their populations and resources explode, these states expand into Mahajanapadas, which are great regional states. And finally, through intense conquest and consolidation, they scale up into vast, unified empires. Understanding this progression is absolutely key because it proves that empires didn't just appear out of thin air. They were the final result of thousands of years of compounding growth, driven by that initial agricultural spark. All right, Section 3, the 16 Mahajanapadas. Things are about to get fiercely competitive. Now, what's really interesting about this NCERT map is how the spatial distribution of these 16 Mahajanapadas overlays perfectly with those early iron finds we just talked about. These great states emerged precisely in the fertile, iron-rich Ganges plains. And that wasn't a coincidence at all. The sources show a very clear geographic clustering. Control over land, agricultural production, and emerging trade routes had become the ultimate prize. And these 16 states, they were locked in a constant, fierce struggle for it. This was an era completely defined by shifting alliances, rapid militarization, and intense competition, as each Mahajanapada frantically sought to absorb its neighbors and control the massive wealth being generated by those rich river valleys. So out of all 16 of these states, one absolute powerhouse rises above the rest: Magadha. Located in present-day Bihar, Magadha gradually emerged as the single most powerful Mahajanapada. Why them? Well, the texts point to a perfect storm of advantages. First off, they had a highly strategic geographical location, totally surrounded by natural defenses like hills and rivers. They utterly dominated the most fertile agricultural plains, which gave them basically endless food and tax revenue. Plus, the surrounding forest provided a huge supply of elephants for their army, which was a massive, game-changing military advantage at the time. But crucially, they were led by a series of exceptionally strong, wildly ambitious rulers, visionaries like Bimbisara and his son Ajatashatru, who relentlessly pursued expansionist policies. Magadha essentially won the resource competition, and by doing so, they became the unstoppable launchpad for the very first massive empires. Which brings us to Section 4, the Age of Empires. Time to unify the subcontinent. Let's trace how this political expansion rippled outwards across the subcontinent. From the fierce competition of the Mahajanapadas between 600 and 300 BCE, Magadha's expansion culminated spectacularly in 321 BCE with the foundation of the Mauryan Empire by Chandragupta Maurya. This was a total watershed moment in history. But power didn't just stay centralized up in the north. If you look at the timeline, it shows a distinct southern shift too. By 200 BCE, moving into 300 CE, we see the Satvahana Empire rising up in the Deccan Plateau. And further south, roughly from 300 BCE to 300 CE, the early kingdoms of Tamilakam really began to flourish, including the formidable Cheras, Cholas, and Pandyas. The whole concept of a massive, centralized state had truly gone continental. Now, managing territories of this unprecedented size, that requires a massive leap in governance. The Mauryan Empire and, centuries later, the Gupta Empire successfully unified vast regions of northern India. But you absolutely cannot run a continent-spanning empire with the simple kingship models of the past. When your borders stretch for thousands of miles incorporating incredibly diverse peoples and economies, you need a highly structured, multi-layered system of administration. You need systematic, rigid taxation just to fund the state apparatus. And you need a massive, professionalized military organization to maintain order and protect those vital trade routes. The bureaucracy behind these empires became incredibly sophisticated. Sure, supreme authority still rested with the king, but rulers were heavily assisted by a Mantri Parishad, acting as a vital council of ministers to advise on complex policy. To actually manage all that vast land, empires were subdivided into manageable provinces, and then broken down even further into districts called aharas, governed by specialized officials. Down at the very local level, the real backbone of the empire, village headmen known as gramakas managed daily affairs and collected local revenues. And the state was incredibly hands-on. They heavily regulated agriculture, secured sprawling trade routes, and literally mandated the building of massive irrigation works to ensure the economy kept humming, no matter the season. The scale of civilization had reached a highly sophisticated administrative peak. And hey, it is vital to understand that this massive scaling of civilization was happening in the south as well. The sources point out that agricultural wealth, particularly from the highly fertile Kaveri, Tamarpani, and Vaigai river valleys, directly drove the rise of powerful southern polities like the Cholas, Pandyas, and Cheras. We know this brilliantly from Sangam literature. If you aren't familiar, Sangam literature refers to these massive collections of ancient Tamil poetry, composed by brilliant scholars and poets who gathered in historic assemblies. These poetic texts vividly document the incredible fertility of the southern lands. They give us detailed accounts of the cultivation of highly lucrative crops like pepper, turmeric, sugarcane, and paddy. It was this intense, sustained agricultural wealth that fueled these southern powers, allowing the Cholas and their neighbors to build their own magnificent, sprawling empires. And finally, Section 5, Recap and Transition. Let's look at the grand narrative arc here. So, the crucial point is this strict chain of cause and effect we've been tracing over the last 3,000 years. It begins with technology. Iron tools create an agricultural surplus. That surplus permanently anchors previously nomadic people to a specific territory. This brand new territorial identity births the Janapadas, who inevitably begin competing for resources. That fierce competition leads to conquest by highly strategic states, most notably Magadha. And finally, that conquest scales up into the complex, multi-layered, continent-spanning empires that completely define the ancient Indian subcontinent. Every single step directly triggers the next, forming an unbroken chain from the very first iron axe all the way to the towering heights of the Mauryan and Gupta dynasties. It's just an incredible journey, right? Going from a simple household to a vast ancient empire. And it leaves us with a really compelling thought. As we look back at this ancient evolution, this literal shift from bloodline to boundary line, how do these foundational shifts in territorial identity, which started thousands of years ago with a simple iron plow in the soil, still dictate the very real, modern political borders we live within today? It's something to truly think about. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll catch you in the next one.